And let's start our first presenter for today. Our first speaker is Ms. Catherine Hazel M. Aguilar. And Ms. Aguilar is a university researcher of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Her presentation is entitled Traditional Rice-Based Agroecosystems Ecosystem in Kiangan, Ifugao, Philippines, Drivers of Change, Resilience, and Potential Trajectories. Ms. Aguilar, the Zoom floor is yours.
All right. Hi, a pleasant morning to everyone. Once again, I'm Catherine Hazel Aguilar from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. At the outset, I would like to thank the Ifugao State University for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share the findings of the resilience assessment that I did a few years back, together with now retired Professor Tess Borromeo, Professor Nestor Altaveros, Dr. Helen Dayo, and Dr. Parviz Kahafkan. And of course, with the valuable assistance of the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement, headed by Sir Marlon Martin and the Kiangan local government. This project, by the way, was an initiative of the World Agricultural Heritage Foundation to assess the resiliencies of the GIA's designated Ifugao rice terraces, as well as the biodiversity of global significance and ecosystem goods and services. And as for our work, we mainly focused on the traditional rice-based agroecosystem in Kiangan, looking into the drivers of change, resilience, and potential trajectories. So in 2002, the FAO initiated a global partnership that aimed to identify, support, and safeguard agroecosystems of global significance throughout the world. And these agroecosystems are what we now know as the globally important agricultural heritage systems. And the Ifugao rice terraces is one of them, and the clusters in Hungduan and Kiangan were officially designated as GIAs in 2011. Now, these traditional agricultural systems are the products of coevolution of these two systems, the social system and the ecological system. Now, these two are intricately linked or interconnected, wherein people, societies, cultures are shaped by, dependent on, and evolving with the biophysical or the ecological system. So in the case of the Ifugao agroecological system, the Ifugao culture, people, and society are highly dependent on the ecological system. They are shaped by their ecological system, the Ifugao rice terraces. And likewise, the state of the ecosystem, the biosphere, is shaped by the social system. Now, one of the important features of social ecological systems is resilience. This is the ability of a system to absorb disturbances and shock and adapt to stress and change in ways that continue to support human well-being. And the Ifugao rice terraces, like most rural frontier landscapes around the world, are facing challenging times because of rapidly evolving socioeconomic and ecological pressures. And as you can see here, some of the ecological and anthropogenic pressures, we have the global climate change, human population increase, the ecological degradation, extractive human activities, modernization, among others. They are threatening to transform the agricultural landscape, decrease agrobiodiversity, and modify the lifestyle of the farmer and the communities and their well-being. And these changes increase the vulnerability of the communities, particularly in this case, the Ifugao communities, and may have substantial impacts on the ecosystem services provided by the Ifugao agroecosystem. Now, to overcome the deleterious effect of these changes, an agroecosystem must therefore manifest the innate capacity for resilience and adaptability. Through this study, we were able to evaluate Kiangan's social ecological system using criteria as specified in the Modified Sustainable Livelihood Framework. and an estimate of the resilience capacity of the Kiangan agroecosystem amidst current societal upheavals, shifting priorities, and global climate change was also obtained through farmer-centered approaches and with the use of standardized social ecological descriptors or indicators. Furthermore, we analyzed the interrelationships of agrobiodiversity, indigenous knowledge systems, resilience, and the provision of ecosystem goods and services in Kiangan as they relate to conservation, landscape maintenance, adaptive capacities, and the general well-being of the Ifugao farmers. To gain a better understanding of the complex, dynamic, and multifaceted interrelations between these many elements of a socio-ecological landscapes, such as the rice agroecosystem in Kiangan, a mixed methodological approach combining quantitative and qualitative methods was employed in this study. And as you can see here, we basically did two major activities: the resilience assessment and the documentation and assessment of ecosystem services. So for the resilience assessment, we made use of the different frameworks, and then we carried out workshops, household interviews, and then we also did direct observation and transect walks along and within the rice terraces, the Muyong, the Habal, the entire Kiangan social ecological landscape. And then we also did some resource mapping, timeline approach, key informant interviews, diversity assessment, and geomapping. So this study was confined in two GIAS designated barangays. We have Barangay Nagakadan and Barangay Holongan. And inclusion of Barangay Ambabag was done to provide a contrast to the GIAS areas in terms of the different assessment parameters. So for the assessment workshops, here are some of the methodologies. And we have this set of indicators guided by this modified sustainable livelihood framework. So we look into the different capitals. We have the natural capital, human capital, social capital, physical capital, financial capital, and cultural capital. Now each of these capital has their own indicators. And then we also did household surveys. So an individual survey using semi-structured questionnaire was carried out purposively in each barangay. Then we did transect walks along and within the sites to validate the results from the key informant interviews, household surveys, and FGDs, and as well as to record land use, topography, soils, natural vegetation, cultivation, and other production activities, and human settlement pattern. So basically, these are the driving forces of the Kiangan social ecological system. So we have the ecological and economic sector and the social-cultural drivers. We have agriculture, of course, the subsistence and commercial crop cultivation, forestry, heritage protection and conservation, tourism and recreation, and urbanization. For social-cultural drivers, we have cultural identity, governance, and social relations. We know that the Ifugao traditions and laws are dependent upon her physical world, her nature and environment, and the rice cultivation and the ritual agricultural fields act as the central connecting point of Ifugao social relationships. Now we have these pressures that are acting upon the Kiangan socio-ecological system, and the previous decades have ushered in tremendous changes and even challenges to the Kiangan social ecological system. So we have various anthropogenic pressures and ecological pressures. So we have population dynamics, water demand, introduction of exotic plant and animal species. So we have here the introduction of the different fish species. We have tilapia, we have yuyu, and common carp that were introduced during the 1970s. But then we also have the introduction of kiwit, or the Asian swamp eel, during the early 2000s as an additional food and income source. However, it has inflicted considerable damage to the rice terraces Through its burrowing activities, this exotic species has caused water seepage in dikes and terraces, and consequently, this alters the hydraulic regime in the terraces, resulting in landslides. Meanwhile, we also have the golden apple snail. That's another thing that was introduced during the 1980s to supplement sources of food protein, and it has become a major pest in all rice ecosystems in the country, in fact. And the rapid proliferation of Pomasea canaliculata, or the golden apple snail, has caused the dwindling numbers of endemic edible apple snails and other gastropods. Then we have the ecological pressures as well. And of course, the introduction of the high-yielding varieties in the 1970s. So as early as 1970s, high-yielding rice varieties were introduced in Ifugao, and it has modified the rice cycle and cropping pattern, as well as paved the way. It has paved the way the use of chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and insecticides. And the HYVs, or the high-yielding varieties, have since predominated in the fields at the expense of their traditional counterparts. Modern farming regimes associated with high-yielding varieties necessitated mechanization of farming and intensive use of chemical inputs. And with intensified agricultural production, the traditional farm labor system that we know as ubu or badang, which relied on community solidarity and mutual exchange of labor, become inadequate. And so they shifted to paid labor instead. And then we have the increased access to education and the ingress of Christianity, which likewise resulted in the abandonment of indigenous agroecological management practices. For example, the traditional seed supply system, the farming rituals, and the use of cropping calendars. And then another conspicuous change observed particularly in Nagakadan and Holongan was the conversion of some terraces to commercial gardens for high-value crops. So we have here, they converted some of their terraces into vegetable gardens. So a significant number of rice paddies had also been reclaimed as paved pathways and residential areas. So the combined effects of agricultural modernization, urbanization, and even tourism resulted in the transformation of the Kiangan agricultural landscape. There are hostels and places of accommodation for local and foreign tourists, oftentimes encroach into the terrace areas, marring otherwise the panoramic views of the terraces. And due to the influx of tourists, a notable number of locals have also shifted to non-farming jobs. So instead of tilling the farms, they would become tricycle drivers, tourist guides, and so on. Then we have now the current state and the impacts, the current sociocultural status and ecosystem structure and condition of the Kiangan social ecological system. So we know that there are changes in the forest dynamics and composition, the landscape homogenization, the land degradation, the intensified modern agriculture, and this would consequently lead to reduced resilience to stress and global change pressures. So as you can see here, this is the resilience radar, which shows differential resilience capacities of the 3 barangays in the Kiangan social ecological system. By the way, this data were from the focus group discussions. The farmers scored according to the indicator, 5 being the highest, being the resilient, and 1 as the lowest. So in Nagakadan, relatively higher degree of the disturbances was recorded, and it was based on farmers' perception and knowledge. So remarkably low rating, average rating of 2 for cultural capital, can be ascribed to the abandonment of traditional farming practices, the shift to paid labor, and the extremely low rate of transmission of the indigenous knowledge systems, the tribal youth. So most of the farmers are now aging, and the younger generation are losing interest in farming now. That's reality, I guess, all over the world. And so the prospects of the transmission of the indigenous knowledge systems appear to be bleak. Moderate scores, on the other hand, were generated for the social capital, which is attributable to the lack of farmer and inter-barangay coordination, and this has resulted to asynchronous rice planting, and consequently a more frequent and severe pest and disease infestation in the fields. So there were several terraces that were abandoned within the past 10 years. And with soaring prices for labor, repair, and maintenance of irrigation facilities and the terrace walls, 80% of the farmers that we interviewed abandoned their rice terraces, resulting in shrinking farm sizes. So they abandoned like a few of their terraces and maintained just a number of them. So furthermore, while many of the farmers in Agacadan had shifted to modern agriculture, as you can see here, access to knowledge and skills associated with agrobiodiversity management and conservation has remained limited. And the shift to modern agriculture has also stripped women farmers of their traditional farming roles. So before, women do the planting, the harvesting, the seed keeping, but nowadays most of the agricultural management in the fields are done by men, and thereby leading to moderate scores for human capital. Then the moderate scores for the natural capital, there was a wide scale shift from the traditional rice varieties to high-yielding varieties, as well as the displacement of the endemic flora and fauna in the rice fields. And the age-old rice fish culture, which I showed earlier, was considered like a thing of the past by many farmers. And moreover, only a number of farmers are practicing Sweden farming or the Pincol or Inado system. And so it affected the crop diversity in the fields. So on the other hand, moderate scores were obtained for physical capital and financial capital. This is because of, as you can see, the physical infrastructure in Nagahadan. By the way, this was in 2017. So I don't know how it looks right now. But as you can see, there are concrete roads, pathways, irrigation canals, and houses within the terraces. And then, of course, the use of modern agricultural machineries that are widely used, which makes life easier for them. And they have, right now, better spending capacity because of, like, they have family members that are working outside of Kiangan or even abroad. And however, biodiversity-based livelihoods have been decreasing within the past 10 years. In Holongan, on the other hand, there is highest overall rating for the natural capital, as you can see here. So because of the relatively recent shift to high-yielding varieties, higher biotic diversity was observed in the fields, and the rice plants appeared to be in a better state of health in Holongan. Many terraces, however, had been abandoned in Holongan or converted into commercial vegetable gardens, as you can see here. And so this terrace conversion to commercial vegetable gardens actually occurred as early as 2014, and of late, around 30% of the Holongan farmers practice small-scale subsistence farming, while the remaining, like 70% of the farmers, have shifted to commercial crop cultivation, which consequently led to massive losses of rice genetic diversity in the village. Now, this is a sad reality for the Muyong, or the woodlot. So the communal forest and woodlots in Holongan harbor high macrofloral diversity as revealed by the farmers, and as we have observed during transect walks. While a wide assortment of endemic flora thrive in the Muyong, clearing operations, as you can see in these photos, were underway, such as for the establishment of commercial coffee plantations. So visual inspection revealed that a significant number of trees had already been girdled and left to wither and die. Meanwhile, the farmers in Holongan gave lowest scores for physical capital owing to insufficient infrastructure such as irrigation canal systems and better farm-to-market roads. So now for Barangay Ambabag, just to make a comparison. So Ambabag farmers who had completely abandoned traditional farming and rice varieties since as early as 1980s ironically gave moderate scores for cultural capital. So in fact, it's higher than in Nagakadan, and high scores for human capital. Moderate scores for the natural capital, however, do not conform to actual woodlot and rice field observation. So it does not conform with what we actually saw in the field. And we saw that the farmers relied heavily even on chemical inputs and paid labor, and this oftentimes trapped them in a vicious cycle of poverty and indebtedness. In Ambabag farms, moreover, poor sanitation and cultural management has resulted in infestation by a wide array of pests and diseases, as well as the profuse growth of unwanted weeds in the rice fields. And as for the physical capital, Ambabag garnered the higher scores because of its adequate facilities such as concrete roads and other social infrastructure. So for the impacts, now we see that there might be a loss of natural habitats in the long run, the erosion of biological and ecological diversity, like the loss of traditional varieties, which I will show to you later on, the list of the traditional varieties that we saw during the 2017 cropping season. And then there is a short-term increase in agricultural production with the introduction of modern rice cultivars. However, there is a degradation and changes in agroecological ecosystem services, flow, and interactions. Now, you would see here the predominant features of terraces in Barangay Nagakadan and Holongan. I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, but the blue dots, as you can see there, that's for Barangay Nagakadan and Holongan, represent the modern cultivars, the high-yielding varieties that are present in the field during the 2017 cropping season. And as you can see, there are more than like 70% of the terraces were planted to modern varieties, and only like less than 30% were planted to traditional varieties. So abandoned terraces were recorded to be at like 4.78%. And in Holongan, 60% of the terraces, however, had traditional varieties, but in Nagakadan, majority of the terraces were planted to modern or high-yielding varieties. So here are the different rice varieties that were cultivated in Nagakadan, Holongan, and Ambabag during the 2017 cropping season. So there were a total of 16 rice varieties. But in 1960s, take note, there were more than 30 traditional rice varieties in Kangan. But now there are only 6 traditional varieties, and the rest are introduced or high-yielding varieties. So Nagakadan had the greatest number of traditional varieties during the 2017 cropping season, as you can see in this graph. And Botnol and Bangkitan are the most widely cultivated non-glutinous and glutinous varieties, respectively. So there were 6 introduced commercial varieties that were recorded in Nagakadan, and the most widely cultivated were C4 and what they call as Oakland. Meanwhile, in Holongan, there were 5 traditional varieties and 5 introduced commercial cultivars, while in Ambabag, there was no traditional varieties planted in 2017. All of the varieties planted in Ambabag were introduced or high-yielding varieties. So these are some of the traditional rice varieties. So we have, of course, the Tinawon and the Dikit or Dayakot. And then we have the high-yielding varieties. We even recorded an unknown variety that was being tested by the Department of Agriculture. And then we have here the diversity of flora, macroflora in the rice terraces. So most of these are utilized as food, as you can see. And the terrace rice fields in Kiangan are observed to harbor several macrofloral species that they are that they utilized as food and even fodder and fertilizer. So here are some of the macrofloral species found in the rice terraces. We also have several species and varieties of azolla. Then we have the diversity of the aquatic fauna in the terraces. So we have 12 faunal species. We have 7 species of mollusks, 2 amphibians, and 1 crustaceans. Then there are 2 species of fish. So most of them are found in Holongan, except in 2017, we did not find kiwit in Holongan. I'm not sure right now if they already have kiwit in Holongan. But most of these species, all of them, except for the kiwit, were found in Holongan. And then we also have a few in Ambabag. So here are some of the aquatic fauna in the terraces. Then we have the macrofloral diversity in the woodlots or in the muyong. A total of 124 floral species, which were resolved into 58 families, were identified along the 9 transects with 10 sampling plots each, established in Nagakadan, Holongan, and in Upper Poblacion. So these woodlots are of prime importance since they harbor endemic species with high economic and ecological values. And collectively, they serve as invaluable sources of food, timber, and medicinal plants, among others. So here are the number of individuals per barangay. So we have 54 species in Holongan, 47 species in Nagakadan, and 11 species in Upper Poblacion. In Upper Poblacion, most of the trees planted were Gimelina and mahogany trees, which were distributed by the DNR for reforestation activities. So the top 10 species with highest species importance values in Barangay Holongan, Nagakadan, and Upper Poblacion. So you can see that in Upper Poblacion, we have the Gimelina. And in Nagakadan, we have the mahogany. So the greatest diversity was observed for endemic trees and understory vegetation in Barangay Holongan. Unfortunately, like what I've mentioned earlier, a number of endemic trees in the area had been girdled in preparation for the establishment of an Arabica coffee plantation during the time of our field work. So here are the list of the understory species with the highest species importance value in the 3 barangays. Then here are some of the species with conservation status based on IUCN Red List and the DAO 2007 1. So we have here some endemic species, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered species. So here are some photos. All right. So we have the community responses to the pressure, state, and impacts. So as we have gathered from our interviews, household surveys, and FGDs, we came up with this list of existing programs. We have Adopt a Terrace program, School of Living Traditions, the integration of Ifugao IKS in school curriculum, and the establishment of ITCHO, or the Ifugao Cultural Heritage Office, the annual tribal festivities, and we also have the Ifugao Rice Terraces Master Plan. So there, the School of Living Traditions. And then we have also the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement, which is a non-governmental organization that has taken the role of leading social trust building and training the local community in Kiangan to participate in the community-based tourism business. And SITMO aggressively promotes cultural revitalization by organizing and supporting women loom weavers and by giving occasional financial support to farmers to carry out traditional farming rituals. And these efforts are being done so that Ifugao farming rituals will not go the way that the ancient rice fish culture, which had ceased to be practiced by the farmers with the advent of agricultural modernization. So we have here the provision of ecosystem services in Kiangan agroecological system. And as you can see, most of the ecosystem services are degraded for the past 10 to 20 years. So there is a decline in terms of the different ecosystem services. So again, for the payo or the terraced rice fields, there is a negative effect. The land use change, agricultural modernization, even population pressure, tourism, climate change, acculturation, and migration have negative effect when it comes to the provision of food and the genetic resources. And again, for the Muyong, the same factors have negative effect to the provision of food, genetic resources, timber, fiber, fuel, and even medicinal resources. And same with the Habal or Uma and the water resources. So all of this have negative effects to the provision of this ecosystem goods and services. So same with the cultural services, the knowledge systems, cultural heritage, the recreation and aesthetic values, they have negative impacts to these services, except for the educational values. So because of the acculturation and outmigration, there is an enhanced or positive effect to the educational values. And so in summary, all of these societal changes associated with modernization have transformed the Kiangan social ecological system, which has resulted to decreasing trends in cultural, natural, and social capital. And as you can see here, these threats, intensified crop production, crop homogeneity, forest destruction, and abandonment of rice cultivation, has negative impact and caused the decline in the provision of ecosystem services, may it be cultural, regulating, provisioning, and supporting ecosystem services. And this might lead to the vulnerability to a vulnerable Kiangan agroecological system if it would not be mitigated. So for the trajectories, so there are two possible trajectories that could be taken by the system. And so if these steps will be taken into consideration, like the implementation of an institutionalized program that will promote and implement the integration of sustainable conservation and management with agricultural production, this might lead to sustainably managed, resilient social ecological system in Kiangan. However, the other trajectory, if there is a complete shift to modern agricultural system, there is an intensified cultivation of high-yielding varieties and other plantation crops and high-value crops, this may lead to the irreversible loss of Kiangan's social ecological system. So this, everything may happen. So this trajectories presented here shows the deleterious effects of identified major driving forces to the Kiangan social ecological system. So although telltale signs of the regime shifts were observed during fieldwork, this unique agroecosystem was still able to conserve its main features and thus had not yet shifted. So we have here the regime A and regime B. So right now, currently, the Kyangan social ecological system is still in here, regime A. It has not yet shifted to regime B that would be leading to a vulnerable social ecological system. So what will be the factor causing the shift? So if the system will be market oriented and will decrease the provision of ecosystem goods and services, it might lead to a vulnerable social ecological system. So unless interventions are instituted as soon as possible, the Kyangan social ecological system might become trapped in undesirable agro-ecosystem trajectories from which the likelihood of bouncing back to its original state would no longer be visible. So I guess that would be all. Thank you very much. Would like to thank the World Agricultural Heritage Foundation, Dr. Parviz Kahafkan, for funding this study, the assistance of the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement, and all of the farmers organizations in Nagakadan, Holongan, and Ambabag. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aguilar, for a very comprehensive presentation on the status of the Nagakadan and its nearby areas. And really, we saw the drivers of change and the vulnerability of our rice terraces and the things we need to do to conserve our rice terraces. And the presentation actually does not only apply to Nagakadan but other GS areas in Ifugao. And so thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's really good for us to listen to the researches conducted here and that we can use this in really in policy, in advancing policies and other possible things that we can for the conservation of the rice terraces. Before we proceed to the next presenter, may we request